Uh, I guess maybe I wasn't clear enough. I didn't make any abstract criticisms of capitalism as a system. I said, in fact, that the last 26 years in Latin America were such the economic growth failure was so long and so profound that it was actually rare in the history of capitalism. The normal history of capitalism actually is economic growth, although it doesn't necessarily happen by itself. Most of the countries that have reached the club of rich countries today have had a whole set of active government policies to promote that growth and development, including the United States, which was the most protectionist country in the world from 1873 to the First World War, when it was a developing country and also a very fast-growing country. So I don't have a general prescription. I think the policies in the different countries are going to be different because the economies are all different. In Argentina, they were able to get their economy growing quite fast and pull, as I said, 11 million people out of poverty simply by correcting some macroeconomic policies that were wrong: exchange rate policy, interest rate, monetary policy, and of course getting rid of the debt burden, which if they had tried to negotiate a better solution for the creditors, could have hobbled their economy for years. In Venezuela, the main thing they had to do, without which they could not have provided any of the health care, education, or restarted the economic growth of the economy, was to get control over the national oil industry, because that's about a third of GDP. It's half of their exports. It's 80% of their exports, and it's half of their government budget. So in Bolivia, they have a much harder problem. They're a low-income country still, although they're on the borderline now. So they have to come up with even a more difficult development strategy. So that's why land reform is a big part of their development, as it was in the history of other successful countries like South Korea and Taiwan, for example. So I think there are many paths to development, and I think one of the greatest mistakes that the IMF and the World Bank and their whole creditors cartel that was able to exert such powerful influence in developing countries for so long until very recently, one of the biggest mistakes they made was try to prescribe a textbook kind of Econ 101 one-size-fits-all policy to almost all the governments that they advised and that they were able to pressure, in fact. So that's my short answer to your short question.
Are the paths to development being followed by Brazil, Chile, and Mexico today in the last 10 or 15 years? Are they amongst these possibly successful paths to development, or are they to be differentiated from Bolivia, Venezuela?
Chile is differentiated because it's the only country in the entire Western Hemisphere that has grown faster since 1980 than before, which shows you. What's that?
You didn't mention that before.
Well, I mean, I wasn't talking about Chile, and I had 15 minutes for the beginning, which I probably went over. Brazil is an example I did mention. I think that that has been a terrible failure. That was once, that's potentially a very rich country. That was a fast-growing country. That was a country that would be quite well off today if they had just continued at the pace and with some of the same policies. Of course, these policies have to change over time because you reach a different stage. But if they had continued with the success they had from prior to 1980, you could take the 60s, the 70s, the 50s. That was extremely successful. And since 1980, their growth has been abysmal. Now, they've had a little bit better growth in the last 3 years, but with 11.25% interest rates set by the central bank, I mean, think about what the United States would look like that. I mean, that's very harsh. And that's one of the policies that they're going to have to change if they're going to grow. Mexico, again, they doubled in size, again, per capita basis from 60 to 80, and they hardly grew at all over the next 2 decades. And their growth since NAFTA, by the way, has also been very sluggish.
So these are your examples of failed capitalism.
Well, Brazil and Mexico, I think, you're looking at, Mexico, you got 40-something% of the population below the poverty line. Yeah, I would say that's quite a serious failure since the 80s, not prior. Prior to the 80s, they were developing. They were both developing countries. And I should add, this was not phenomenal growth we're talking about. This was still less than half of what South Korea and Taiwan and some of the Asian countries have done. Okay, so we're talking about normal growth. That's what collapsed in the last 26 years.
Well, it is certainly true that he is responding to his constituency in proposing greater distribution of wealth to the indigenous. I don't think the indigenous prompted him and coaxed him and pleaded with him to add to the referendum he's pushing that he be allowed to run for re-election again. That, I think, he stole wholesale from Chavez. There's a lot of personal political aggrandizement for Morales in this particular referendum he's pushing, as well as a lot of useful efforts to raise the lot of the indigenous. But don't forget, he was elected by the indigenous. This is like offering, perhaps you think I'm uncharitable, but offering vast new programs and prosperity to the indigenous is simply playing to his base. It's the Bolivian equivalent of earmarks for congressmen to their people at home. Now, maybe it's the right thing to do too. I'm not saying it isn't, but don't disguise it as anything, altruistic. He's a politician and he knows what he needs to do to please his base, and he added on some particularly difficult items for himself as well.
Can I have to just correct one thing. The draft of the Constitution that Joel refers to does not extend Evo Morales' term. It limits it, in fact, to 2 terms.
He's now only able to have 1.
That's not true. Under the old Constitution, they could also have 2 terms, and it just couldn't be consecutive. And my understanding is that this one limits it to 2 terms, period. But they can be consecutive. But the idea that it's removing term limits was a false report in the media. The LA Times and a couple other papers have run corrections in the last couple of weeks. It definitely did not try. There's no draft of the Constitution that anybody has found, and not the one that's passed, that enables the president to have more terms than he had before.
Offer my view here. First of all, I'm an opinion columnist at this point in my life. I'm an op-ed opinion columnist. I'm not a straight down the line journalist any longer. This is an op-ed opinion that offers my opinion. But I do think that, yes, you're absolutely right that the idea of revising the Constitution has been around in Bolivia for a very long, long time. However, what I was referring to in this discussion was his notion of improving his lot as a president. And I think there is a big difference between having a term in office and then timing out and then coming back. And this has happened in Bolivia, no doubt about it, more than once. Timing out and then running again down the road, and having the ability to run consecutive 2 terms. I didn't say that it was unlimited, consecutive 2 terms. This is the same kind of shenanigan that was on the ballot here in California last week. We went down, right. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's a good question. I think, why did it take 26 years? And if I can amend your question a little, not no economic growth, but very slow and very slow economic growth for countries to reject the policies of the past and look for alternatives, and why did they're all doing it at once? Well, there's a number of reasons. I think what had to happen first of all, and that's why the social movements were mentioned. They had to organize. In Bolivia, the demand for nationalizing their gas and for a constituent assembly, people were in the streets over that. They rioted over that. They fought their governments, and all kinds of things were tried. I mean, for a long time in Latin America, in 1973, for example, 1970, a social democratic government, or you would perhaps call it a socialist government, which is okay. He called himself a socialist. Salvador Allende was elected in Chile, and the President Nixon worked for 3 years to overthrow that government, and he successfully did that, and there was a dictatorship there for 17 years, a very brutal one. So people couldn't organize for very much there at all. In Brazil, there was a dictatorship that lasted into the late 80s, and it took quite a while for them to organize a strong enough movement to elect Lula. Had to run 4 times before he was elected. And, you know, by the way, the media plays an even bigger and more destructive role in Latin America than it does here in the United States, because you don't have the kind of internet coverage that you have here. And so they're not even under the kind of pressure. So, and the monopolies are really tight. Like in Mexico, it's basically a duopoly, and they can swing elections, you know. So that's really a big part of the story as well. It's very hard. You have to go against all these established institutions, including, you know, some of the political repression that I described in the countries. And there was political repression in most of these countries, actually, that we're talking about. And so they had to have enough democracy to do it. They had to have enough organization. And again, I have to come back. I'm sorry to be an economist here, but I really do think that the most powerful force, external force, besides the, well, look, the Sandinistas, you covered that. They voted for their government in 1984. And what happened? It was a democratic election, and they didn't change anything in terms of our foreign policy. The United States continued to fund a war and kill thousands of people until that government was removed in 1990. And then, of course, he came back just, you know, last fall, in spite of the fact that our government threatened Nicaragua. The Bush administration threatened them with a cutoff of remittances, with all kinds of economic sanctions, denial of loans. And the people still, by a plurality at least, voted to return the president that the United States got rid of. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, the U.S. is a major force, and they did use, at various points, governments, they supported governments and massive violence. Genocide in Guatemala, the UN called it genocide. That was a series of military dictatorships that were mainly supported by the United States, installed by the United States beginning in the 1950s. So you have to go country by country, and you have a story that explains the answer to your question. But I do want to emphasize the role of that creditors cartel, because the way it was set up, you know, this was more powerful, I think, than the military and paramilitary in determining this history. The way it was set up, if a government didn't agree with the economic policies of the IMF, it wouldn't get money from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Paris Club, which is the rich countries, and sometimes even the private sector. So that was very, very powerful in terms of not being able to elect a government that would change the economic policies that Washington was supporting over the last 30 years. Well, you know, you haven't had rapid, I mean, the region as a whole has only been growing at a moderate rate for the last 3 to 4 years. So it's hard to see, you know, you can see some. I mean, in Brazil, you had quite an increase in deforestation, for example. But I wouldn't say that's necessarily the result of growth. You know, like growth doesn't have to be environmentally destructive. It depends where the growth takes place and how. And but you know, there's always, I mean, the way things are set up now, there is some cost to economic growth. There is environmental cost. Social cost, the social cost is, you know, is really negative in the sense that the you know, all of the countries that have grown over the last few years, where you have had reasonable growth, have had these big poverty reductions. I mentioned Argentina and Venezuela because those are the 2 fastest growing countries. But even the ones that have just grown a little, like Brazil, they managed to, under Lula, they managed to raise the minimum wage. They managed to expand the Bolsa Familia program, for example, which is a program to alleviate poverty in the countryside. It wasn't a lot of money. It was about 0.25% of GDP, but it made a difference for maybe 10 million, 15 million people. So I think the social results are still positive, and they're getting better as new norms are established, right? That's why I think these governments are going to be around for a long time, because compared to the past, people really didn't get didn't have much hope at all 10 years ago.
I've worked in a lot of these countries. I've worked in countries in the Middle East and other places where the United States is thought to be unpopular, and almost to a person, except perhaps on the streets in Morocco, you find that the people are admiring of America. People will line up to get visas to come to America while their leaders are exhorting them to believe the United States is about to invade or do whatever they think will work politically to say. So America remains pretty popular among the people of most of these countries. And you will find Venezuelans all over Miami at the Bal Harbour shops buying expensive goods if they have money. And that's true of a lot of countries. One more point I want to make. The question you asked about why suddenly did these socialist countries arise. Democracy was fairly new in many of these countries, and it did not perform, and it was only in recent years that alternatives began to arise, and how that happened is not entirely clear-cut and documentable, but Chavez, who came to power in a coup after all, did prove to be a powerful example. I remember my last job was traveling with Secretary Rice when she'd go on her trips abroad, and I remember one to Latin America in 2005. And we stopped in Brazil, and it was very clear from talking to Lula and his aides, they were afraid of Chavez. They could not say anything negative about him because most of the people in their country, this is 2 years ago, admired him. And they were afraid to say anything against him, but they really did not like him because he was stirring up their people in a way that was not to their benefit. And that was true in nation after nation in Latin America, and I think in Bolivia and Ecuador and some other places, other leaders arose partly as a result of the foment that Chavez intended to raise and did in fact raise among many of the people in Latin America.
Sorry to have to correct, this one was, I think, a slip of the tongue. You said that Chavez, just so in case anybody doesn't know this, I'm sure you know that Chavez did not come to power in a coup. He came to power in a democratic election in 1998. Yeah, and in fact, nobody makes, that was just a typo, but it is important. I want to emphasize that not just that he was elected in 1998, but he was reelected, and that these are is reelected twice already, and he won a recall referendum in 2004. And these are extremely clean elections, much cleaner than we have here. I can describe the process for you if you want sometime, but basically you have a machine and you press a button, and then it prints out a paper receipt, and you have to look at the receipt, and then the receipt goes in a ballot, but you put the receipt in a ballot box, and then you make sure that it matches what's on the screen, and then they count over half of the paper ballots and compare them to the machine, so it's impossible to fix. And nonetheless, you do have people, including the Wall Street Journal editorial board, that still maintains that these elections were somehow stolen, which is on a par with kind of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. Just to get back to your overall question about anti-Americanism, first of all, I don't think these governments are anti-American. Chavez is a baseball player, okay? Nobody who loves baseball hates the United States. And in fact, the government and all the pro-baseball players that come from Venezuela, of course. But more important than that, in terms of actions, a couple of years ago, a number of senators wrote to all 9 of the oil companies operating in the United States and asked if they could provide home heating oil assistance to poor people in the United States because prices had gone up so much and the winter was approaching. And the only company that responded was Citgo, which is owned by Venezuela. And they're now providing about $100 million a year of home heating oil assistance to, hundreds of thousands of people. And, people that hate America wouldn't do that, okay? And in fact, if you look at what Chavez says, he never says bad things about Americans or the country. He doesn't like Bush, and he doesn't like what he calls empire. And, you know, either do I, okay? I think empire is a bad thing, and that's the common bond. And you know, this again, I'm sorry to have to disagree with you, but you said we disagree on everything. You know, the Brazilian government is a divided government, right? It's you know, there are a lot of people in there that are from the right, and those are the ones that Joel was referring to, that he talks to. But if you look at what President Lula da Silva has done, he's the president of the country, okay? He's still in charge, as far as I know. He has consistently supported Chavez. And Chavez supports him too, because they have a common project. All of these countries realize that they've gotten a bad deal, okay? And, you know, for instance, one of their common projects is just regional economic integration. That's why they created recently the Bank of the South, you know, which is 7 countries now. And it's South America, but the vast majority of South America is in, and they're going to have maybe $7 billion to start out. And the purpose is to fund, one of the purposes is to fund regional economic integration projects, so they don't have to just try and strike their separate deals with the U.S. and remain in this kind of relationship, which is very unhealthy. You're going to see just how unhealthy it is in the next year, because Mexico is going to have a horrible recession when we have our recession, because 85% of their exports go to the United States, and it's going to be much worse there than it is here, believe me. And so they have a whole set of policies, and that's why they, you know, all these predictions, this is where the media has gotten it consistently wrong. They've consistently said, you know, let's you and him fight, you know, Lula and Chavez can't possibly get along with each other. The Bolivians nationalized the gas that the Brazilian gas company, oil company, Petrobras owns. They're going to have a fight about that. Guess what happened? Petrobras is investing $800 million, this record level of investment now in the Bolivian gas industry after the nationalization. And now even Chile wants to get in on the investment, and Argentina as well. So all of these predictions that these governments really secretly didn't like each other. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of people you can talk to in these governments. They're the people that, you know, have their heart and soul here in Washington, a lot of them. And a lot of them just don't like the left governments that the people voted for. And for whatever reason, they're going to tell you that, you know, whatever is going on and I talk to all of these people all the time, you know, on both sides. And those people are going to tell you that, you know, everyone hates Chavez, and they only put up with him because he has oil. But the fact is, you look at the public statements. I mean, Lula defended Chavez when the government of Venezuela denied a broadcast license to the biggest TV station there. He said, hey, you know, it's a broadcast license. This isn't a free speech issue. He said, this is, you know, this is a government decision, and he supported it. And the English-speaking press didn't report that. You had to read that in Portuguese. But it nonetheless happened, and you can go down all the line for the last 2 years, and Lula has consistently supported Chavez, and all of them are getting along quite well.
I think we're running out of time. Well, I would just say one last thing, and that is that I think this is the first time, and hopefully the last one, that I'll be portrayed as a right-winger. Did I say you were right-winger? Well, I speak only to people on the right. The person I spoke to most directly about this when I was in Brazil was Lula, not right-wing political parties. First, on socialism, there are elements of socialism in our economy. There are elements of socialism in most free economies, but some countries have fallen down that hole in to a much greater extent than we have. Many countries in Europe and some countries in Latin America. That was a long question about the media, but let me see if I understand it. And that is that perhaps the media is reporting negatively about Latin America because of the competition we, the United States and other countries, now facing from other industrialized nations in China and elsewhere? Is that more or less what you're asking?
Yes, and also that the governments in Latin America are exerting control over their own resources and not just handing them on cheaply to the United States.
Well, I'm going to quote a fellow who I interviewed shortly after I got out of college and shortly after he got out of prison by the name of John Ehrlichman. When I interviewed him in about 1975, I'd ask him questions, and almost every time he would say, "I disagree with the premise of your question." I don't think the media, we've heard all evening here about the media as if we're a cabal and we get together and think about what we're going to report and report it all together and form an opinion and then let that dictate how our stories run. I don't think there is pervasive negative coverage of Latin America. I think there's relatively pervasive negative coverage of Hugo Chavez, and it's probably not surprising given how vitriolic he is about the United States. But we have a correspondent, we, the New York Times, my former employer, have a correspondent there, and if you read all his stories, some of them can be perceived as negative, and some of them do not. This is a persistent theme that any journalist gets, and that is if you, from the point of view of someone who has an ideology, and Mark, I would suggest that you have an ideology.
I certainly hope not.
Coverage that does not agree with your ideology is therefore characterized as negative. And I was a newspaper journalist for 31 years, and nobody ever once at any time ever from senior levels of management came to me and told me how to write a story. Or there would never once there's an intimation what the company line is on a certain issue. That does not happen in journalism. It is certainly true that a mood sweeps over the country on a certain issue, and we are members of the country, and that can affect our coverage. But there is no cabal of conspiracy of coverage that dictates that we have to write about a certain thing a certain way.
If I can comment on that, I won't comment on the institutions because obviously you've been a practicing journalist for a decade, so. But I do agree. Actually, there's no monolithic. There's no monolithic media. There's a lot of reporters. A lot of them are trying to do their job, but the result does not come out balanced by objective standards in many ways. And I mean, I gave you one that I think an example that almost everyone realizes where the press really dropped the ball, and that was in the prelude to the Iraq War. This has now been pretty well documented. If the press acts as a conduit by simply repeating over and over and over again this, when the administration associates Saddam Hussein with September 11th, Saddam Hussein, and then 70% of the public ends up thinking that Saddam Hussein was actually involved in the attacks of September 11th. That's a failure. That's a media failure. And in that case, they didn't even, exaggerate or do the kind of things that they do in the Latin America reporting. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it depends what I'm looking at it pretty objectively. I'm not holding journalists to my standards. I don't expect them to report what I think is important. I expect them to report what any objective observer would think is important. So an article, a front page, lengthy article about the Venezuelan economy, which is in the midst of an unprecedented boom with, like I said, I gave several facts, 87% real GDP growth, poverty dropping in half, unemployment dropping by more than half. Somewhere in that article, at least one of those facts should have appeared. If not, then I think that article is not balanced. And that is standard for these articles. I'll give you an even worse example, okay? Here's a really good one that shows you how powerful the media can turn things upside down. On November 7th last year, there was an incident in which the media, the wire services, CNN, and all the media articles that you could find reported as such. They said, pro-Chavez gunmen fired on a demonstration of peaceful of students returning from a peaceful demonstration. That's pretty much an exact quote. Now, I knew that couldn't be true because I've been following Venezuela for years, and there is not repression in that country of peaceful demonstrations. Okay, it's never happened. And so I looked into it, and what I found out was that according to the best available accounts that you could get, and the film footage, is a number of, there was a big student-led demonstration against the government because there was a referendum coming up. And when they returned to the campus, they, a group of them, a large crowd of them, chased a number of pro-Chavez students, trapped them in a building, the School of Social Work, where they were headquartered. And they were outside, and video footage shows them setting the building, starting to set the building on fire, throwing rocks, and saying that they were going to burn down the building. Now, according to witnesses, and in the Wall Street Journal report that followed is also consistent with this, students inside the building were terrified. They called the local radio station. Of course, they called the police, but the police and the National Guard were not allowed to enter the university because the rector of the university is anti-government. This is the Central University in Caracas. And so in Venezuela, they can keep the police out of the university and the guard. They have autonomy there, okay? So they had no help. So they just put out a call on the radio, described what was happening, and many, many people in Caracas carry guns, and people showed up on motorcycles with guns and escorted the people out of the building, and you can see them on the video, which was played on Venezuelan TV, firing and providing cover, not firing into the crowd, but providing cover as terrified students were escaping from the building. Now, this is not the first time this has happened. I mean, if you go back to 2002, there was an actual, the Venezuelan media actually faked film footage to make it look like the government was murdering people in the streets. We now know that wasn't true. And in fact, that was shown all over the world. And the U.S. State Department and the White House both lied because they knew what was going on at the time. And they lied to the public to support that coup and to try to convince the world that it wasn't a coup at all, but just the army intervening to prevent Chavez from ordering people to be shot in the streets. So this was really a flashback just in November. So I could give you literally dozens of examples like that, and I can't give you any on the other side. Like I can't give you any where the reporters mistakenly made the government look good, so I would say that this bias is profoundly reflected in the media, much worse than the reporting that we had that convinced people that Iraq had nuclear weapons and that, and was close to Al-Qaeda. It's many times, I would say, worse than that. And it's a very, very serious problem.